changing your life one story at a time. This is the Chicken Soup for the Soul podcast with Editor-in-Chief Amy Newmark.
Hey, it's Amy Newmark with your daily dose of Chicken Soup for the Soul inspiration. It's Tip Tuesday, and that means that I'm going to give you some advice that I think you can use in your own life. And today I'm going to tell you a very personal story. I've told this story to many people, and they've thanked me for sharing it, and they've told me that it will probably save someone's life. So here's what happened. My husband and I were taking my mother and my sister to see the New York Mets at the new Citi Field Stadium. It was for my mother's 81st birthday, and this was 3 years ago when the stadium was still relatively new. And my sister and my mother came over to our house so that we could all go in one car. And I came downstairs to the kitchen to find my mother looking at our Nespresso coffee machine. And she was looking at it quizzically, and she said, "What is that, an onion?" And I said, "No, Mom, it's a coffee maker." And then she looked at those little pods that go in the machine, and she said, "What are those, little onions?" Now, my mother hates technology, and she hates coffee too. So I just thought that she was fooling around and dissing my Nespresso coffee machine. But then she started calling other things in our kitchen onions, but I still thought she was just being wacky because she can have a pretty wacky sense of humor. So we set off for the ballpark, but my mother continued to act a little weird in the car. And now I'm going to sound like most wives when I say that my mother started praising my husband's driving way too much. It was her praising his driving combined with her calling everything an onion that first got me thinking that maybe she was having a stroke. But I wasn't sure what to do. And so here's where the advice part of this podcast starts, because if you are confronted with this, you don't know what to do. Should you embarrass the person by saying, "Hey, I think you're having a stroke"? So I was struggling with what to do, but I knew we were getting closer to the ballpark. So once we got to Citi Field, I pulled my sister aside and asked her if she thought my mother was acting weird, and she said she thought so too. So then I asked for directions to the paramedic station at the stadium, and then I called my daughter, who was a med student at the time and also a trained EMT, and I asked her what to do, and she said it sounded like a stroke, and she told me that no matter what the doctor said, I should get them to give my mother this miracle drug called TPA, which basically stops the stroke in its tracks. It's as if your brain is a hard drive and it's starting to erase itself, and you need to pull the plug on it so that it stops erasing itself. Well, that's what TPA does. It stops the stroke. But it's dangerous, too. You have to be having the right kind of stroke for TPA to work, and it has to be administered within 2 or 4 hours, depending on the doctor, after the stroke starts. So I took my mother to the paramedic station, but she kept trying to drag me in to see what she called the emperor. And she kept saying, "You have to see the emperor." And then I realized that that was her word for the new Citi Field Stadium. And I think my mother is a very learned, intellectual person. I think she was making the jump from baseball stadium, which is a Latin word, to Colosseum, to Roman emperor, all words with common Latin and historical roots. So I'm trying to steer her towards the paramedics. She's trying to show me the emperor. I got her into the paramedics, and they gave her their normal stroke assessment, which involved holding up a pen and asking her what it was. And she said, "Well, it's a key." And they rushed us off in the ambulance to the stroke unit at a hospital in Queens nearby. And by then, my mother's language skills were really deteriorating. We got the TPA drug at the hospital. It was July 4th. And they tell you that's the worst time of the whole year to go to the hospital, because that's when all the new residents have just advanced to the next level, and only the new guys are working on July 4th. But the doctors did the right thing. They gave her the TPA drug. They were insisting that I find out from my father whether my mother had been acting weird at home that morning, because they needed to figure out the exact number of hours the stroke had been underway. But my parents had been married for 60 years at that point. He really wasn't paying attention to what she was like in the morning. So we gave her the TPA. She survived it. And we got back in an ambulance to go to a more sophisticated stroke unit at a hospital in Manhattan. Now, I learned all of this while this was happening, but after a stroke, the brain swells from the injury and the symptoms get worse and worse. So my mother went from calling things onions to not even knowing her own name. A couple of days later, she finally figured out her first name and her maiden name, but she could not remember her married name. And she just waved it off saying, well, that doesn't really matter, which I thought was really funny considering she was about to have her 60th anniversary. It's interesting, though. Stroke damage is a paradox. I gave her a form to sign one day in the hospital, and she just matter-of-factly signed the form, wrote out her entire name, including her married name, which she couldn't remember. And I showed it to her, and I said, look, if you can't remember your name, just sign it and then read it back to yourself. So my mother was sent home a few days later, and the stroke damage that she had was something called aphasia, which affects your ability to use language and understand language. And she worked really hard at speech therapy, and she's almost fully recovered now, a few years later. And she keeps telling me how grateful she is that I got her help so quickly. But of course, I keep wondering if things would have gone even better if I had taken her to the hospital as soon as she started calling those Nespresso coffee pods onions. Anyway, I've been very impressed with the way she's handled this dramatic change to her senior years. In fact, 2 weeks after the stroke, my mother went back to Citi Field for another Mets game, but she has a new way of facing her fear of having another stroke at the ballpark. And now every time she goes, she buys a gigantic margarita and she sips it for the entire game. And that is how she has managed to go back to Citi Field. So I've told a lot of people this story because honestly, you don't know what to do when you are watching somebody have a stroke, and you almost feel like you would be insulting them if you suggested there might be something wrong with them. So insult away, because they really might be having a stroke and you might be saving them from much worse damage if you jump in there. I actually think this story is so important that we've published it twice. Once in Chicken Soup for the Soul, thanks to my mom, and again in Chicken Soup for the Soul, For Mom with Love. Both books are on sale right now for Mother's Day. I'm Amy Newmark. Thank you for listening to the Chicken Soup for the Soul podcast today. Tomorrow, we're going to have fun. Tomorrow is Wow Wednesday, and I'm going to tell you one of my favorite stories. It's one of those stories that will leave you wondering, was it ESP? Was it angels at work? Was it divine intervention? You'll find out tomorrow. If you'd like to read that story about my mother's stroke, you can go to our website, chickensoup.com.